Well, welcome back, and what a delight to have back with us today Jodell Onstott. She is the author of YHWH Exists, one of the great researchers of our day, and I think she has something to share with us today that is going to be pretty impacting as we adjust our thinking going into this election cycle. First of all, Jodell, hi, good to see you. Welcome.
Thank you, Perry. Great morning. It is a beautiful morning here in the South after months of rain. So I hope it's the same for you.
Well, we're starting to get the break, so we're looking forward to it. Good to see you. Well, listen, we want to talk about religion and economic freedom, the American heritage. Let me give you a question that's been prepared, and I think it sums up where I want to go. It says this: growing up, we were taught to look at America's foundation as a holy endeavor. Pilgrims and Christians fled the European religious persecution to establish liberty for all in America. Their understanding of being persecuted allowed them to create a national code of law in the U.S. Constitution. How has our Constitution been viewed around the world since then?
You know, that is a great question. Originally, we were seen as a beacon of light for all nations. We were seen as the place where you're tired, you're poor, you're oppressed would come, whether it was persecution because of political persecution, political dissidence. Even more modernly, in the last two to 3 years, we've accepted persecuted homeschoolers from Germany. Back in the 80s, we accepted a Russian comedian by the name of Yakov Smirnoff. So we have this long-standing history of accepting political dissidents, of people that cry for liberty. But that is not viewed positively today. It's viewed as something that we are different and we stand out from all the other European nations. And kind of like ancient Israel of old, there's this call to become like the nations that surround us. So I think that when we look at our history, there's a great deal we can learn from it.
Americans are beginning to sense we've lost our way. I mean, the pushback is unbelievable, and it's showing up in some of these campaigns. But more particularly, Jodell, I asked a question on the air early this morning during the news. What makes America unique? What is it about us that is different than any other nation from your perspective?
It's really our stance on constitutional values. The idea that man cannot usurp authority, the fact that man is not greater than the document, than the values imbibed in that document. And I think when we can hold ourselves accountable, we can really come full circle. But if we can't hold ourselves accountable morally, it's not very likely that we're going to be able to have the self-discipline to come back and hold ourselves accountable to a written text.
Was the God that's talked about in our founding documents and maybe even in the Federalist Papers and such, was it the Christian God or a pluralistic God?
You know, you really find that it is this Judeo-Christian God. And I include Judeo-Christian because our roots are very similar. You know, Islam began with a similar root, but it departed very, very quickly right out of the start. So you find in that Judeo-Christian value system, it's very codified, it's very constitutional based, and there isn't a lot of room for plurality in the ideas of each of us having different concepts of God. It's really pretty basic and pretty simple, but yet it allows for incredible liberty within that. So it's not oppressive, it's just that the values and the philosophies that are embraced are absolute, but they're absolute freedom within that. So it might sound like a contradiction, but it really isn't. It's just mainly a lot of the values that we find embraced in the United States Constitution. And even, you know, some of the arguments that you find between the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers, you find that even ancient Israel struggled with some of those ideals. And, you know, there were points in times during the monarchy where the people had to unite with the priesthood to overthrow a particularly oppressive monarch. So but yet the framework is there that allows for that liberty and allows for people to have the self-representation and to have the liberty within their society.
All right, so the liberty found and the freedom found in the Christian life and the parallel of liberty and freedom found in the American life cannot be ignored.
No, not at all. You know, I think, and this is something that I have come across in my own studies, because I used to approach Scripture as something that was very religious. And the more that I study, the more that I see that it is really a government constitution and the religion is secondary. And I think when we do that, it allows for a lot of cohesion across religious denominations, because when we can agree that there's a separation of power, we can agree that it has to be what is written. You know, this whole idea of love for the sake of love becomes very arbitrary, where it can mean anything and it can mean different things to different people. But when it's codified and that justice, you know, I can't just say that I love you, or I can't just say that I'm going to uphold your justice and then go around and oppress you, whether it's taking away your land, or whether, you know, whether we talk about eminent domain today, using that to oppress and chase families off their lands. And sometimes these are farmlands that have been in the family for, you know, generation after generation. So I think that when we come back to law and we come back to that a constitutional document that can give freedom to a land and maintain it, that is where that love is truly expressed, and it can be a foundation of our faith and unite again across political and religious divides.
All right, so really Christianity is the foundation that allows for diversity.
It really does. You know, you find that within the Christian faith, there is an incredible amount of tolerance, an incredible amount of diversity, but yet it still comes back to that founding document whereby, you know, it's not found on Islam, it's not found on Buddhism, it's not found on Hinduism, you know, it's found on that Mosaic code, and it gives just an incredible amount of freedom and stability that you don't find in non-Christian nations. You know, if you look at the history of the Middle East, it is just constant strife, but most of that strife arises from competing clans, competing factions that are based more on Sharia and less on the Mosaic code and the Christian ideals.
Okay, I want to start a conversation here, Lori, that probably will take us, or excuse me, Jodell, that will take us through the break. Let me ask you this. We are struggling right now in the middle of this campaign with the subject of refugees and immigration. And it's an interesting one because it's got our country divided. As a Christian, I have really wrestled with what does the Bible say about this? And we can pull bits and pieces out and probably support our argument. But the big Christian attitude towards this, what do we do with refugees who are fleeing for their lives? Now, integrated into that are some bad people, I get that. But refugees in general are people who are fleeing for their lives. Immigration, same thing, that has been abused. Can you help us get a handle on how we should be looking at this issue from a Christian perspective and from your research as it was dealt with in earlier days?
Yeah, you know, the paradigm that God gave to the ancient nation of Israel, which was a government paradigm, gave the land to all the citizens of Israel. So you didn't really have government land. You didn't have a lot of places for there to be refugee centers. So if we look at that as a paradigm, I think it helps us answer a lot of the questions that we face today. Historically, you look at all nations, whether it's France, Germany, Spain, these nations, because of where they're located, because of the type of government systems that they have that allow for more economic prosperity, people want to go there. They want to come to where, you know, they want to come where the food is. They want to come where there's a better standard of living. I think we would all want to do that. But at the same time, there is this, economically, we know that it is unsustainable. When you research world history, you discover that some of your greatest collapses of civilization arise from massive waves of immigration. So that's something that can't be ignored. So when that society collapses, it's detrimental to not only the native citizens, it's also detrimental to those immigrants. So everybody suffers. So how do you have an immigration policy that is loving, that that helps the downtrodden and the oppressed? And I really think that it kind of comes back to the fact of a policy that is advocated by a Russian dissident. His name is Natan Sharansky, and that is the policy of reciprocity, whereby immigrants are sent back to their homeland, but you help them establish accountability within their own government, the same type of accountability that Western societies enjoy in their government. So it requires a lot of education, and it's not something that's going to be fixed in 5, 10, 15 years. We have this Judeo-Christian heritage that spans thousands of years. I mean, the Magna Carta goes back to the 13th century. So we've been brought up in these ideals for hundreds of years. So it's going to take generations to educate. So many missionaries are doing such great jobs educating people along ideas of accountability, along ideas of love. But I love that is codified. I love that actually means something, and it's just not hot air from politicians.
Well said. Thank you so much. Let me take a break here, Jodell. When we come back, I want you to help us to understand what's happening in Europe and the pressure to do it in the United States. And that is to let these people in from other countries and to set up their own kingdom, so to speak, within our walls. Not necessarily immigrate in, but create their own world within, and how dangerous that may be. So we'll be right back. And let me just say to our viewers and listeners, you need to go to YHWHExist.com. That's Jodell's website, YHWHExist.com. If you haven't gotten Volume 1, you're missing it. It's very, very comprehensive, and it is extremely well researched. It's a must-have in your library, so check it out, YHWHExist.com. We'll be right back.
I'm Paulina Leiser, producer of Focus Today. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to check our other videos at theDove.us.
Okay, we're back with our good friend Jodell Onstott. She is the author of Yahweh Exists. I can't say enough about this book. I have to admit, Jodell, I'm not through reading it.
Takes a while.
It doesn't, you don't get through a 6-inch book overnight, but it's a tremendous resource, and let me encourage you to check it out at YHWHExist.com. That's her website, and I just put her in the category of one of the top researchers of our day, and thank you for your work. All right, as we were going into the break, we were talking about how most European nations and even some Muslim nations are trying to coexist. And in some cases, if that happens, when the Muslims move into a more of a democratic country, they displace a native population. I mean, they are trying to take control. And we have now on our plate a consideration of letting that happen in the United States, whether by force or intimidation, it's there. What does a Christian nation do?
I am a strong advocate of always learning from history. History is indispensable, and I think the worst travesty, one of the worst travesties we've done as a nation is take history out of our public schools and even out of our private schools, because that right there gives us the moral understanding to know how to deal with these issues. So whether we look at ancient Egypt, 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, whether we look at Europe over the last 2,000 years, we find that immigration is always the cause for a fall of society. That society can, for instance, in ancient Spain, it fell to the Muslims. It was oppressed by Muslims for 700 years until Ferdinand and Isabella came into power and they displaced that population. But then they had to use some pretty oppressive means to kind of get the cogency of the empire to put stability back into place. But you have another movement in Europe that is not one that as Christians is one that we like to necessarily talk about, and that is the Holy Roman War, where you had this conflict between Protestant ideals and you had a conflict between Roman Catholic ideals. That conflict erupted in the death of over 20 million Europeans. That's not light. So anytime you have, and the reason this becomes so important is that your religious beliefs will eventually play into political beliefs. You know, people can talk about church, the separation of church and state all they want. The reality is when you go to the polls, most people are going to vote according to their moral or religious convictions. And you're going to probably support the candidate that upholds those moral and religious convictions about how you believe your fellow citizens should be treated, about how you believe the policy should be established. So when we allow another group of people into our land that have political views that are diabolically opposed to constitutional Judeo-Christian American views, that is going to erupt into conflict. We're seeing some of that conflict in Europe already. I'm not sure how well your viewers are aware of the New Year's Day assault on women that occurred throughout Germany and Austria, that area, as well as even in Switzerland and some of the other European nations, where there was just this massive assault on women by immigrant men. And throughout history, one of the ways that has been used to subdue a native population is that the men will come in and they typically will rape the women, pillage, in an effort to create a new society, because those children that come from that act then identify as, you know, Arab or whatever their fathers are. So it's a tool of subjugation that has been around for as long as man has been around. So I don't think that we can stick our head in the sand and just think that loving our neighbor will make the issue go away, as something that I think we have to look at a little bit more realistically and look at the threat to our society.
Boy, that's beautifully said. So what we're not doing is describing and enforcing a simulation. We're just letting it open, right?
Right. You know, and here's the thing. America has always been open to any immigrant population with the idea that you do assimilate. It's when you get these pockets that do not assimilate. And the issue for Sharia, because unlike Christianity, unlike Buddhism, and unlike a lot of your other religious sects, there is not a competing law code that is embraced by that religious sect. Whereas Muslims specifically embrace Sharia law, which totally opposes the Constitution on every single level. They do not recognize human rights. There is a different law for women than there is for men. There's a different law for kafirs, which would be non-Muslim men, than there is for Muslim men. I mean, you have a totally different standard of treating people that goes totally against our preamble of our Constitution state. All men are created equal. Islam does not recognize that. So when you have these parallel cultures, you have these little pockets that refuse to assimilate, and then they gain strength and they gain power. And the next step that they take is to then use the democratic process to enforce Sharia and to get it to displace local policies at, you know, the local government level, and then going on up to the state, and the hope, of course, is the federal level.
What has France and Germany done to themselves?
They have really placed themselves in a quagmire. And I actually am working on a blog post, it's not quite finished yet, of, you know, is this, you know, Germany killed 6 million Jews during the Holocaust, and now they're facing an invasion of 6 million immigrants. Is there some sort of poetic justice, or, I call it karma, where you just reap what you sow. So is there any correlation to this? I leave that open to the reader to decide. But I think that these are questions that we have to ask. God is a God of justice. Thomas Jefferson says that his justice does not sleep forever. So I think when we are dealing with these issues, we have to look at them politically. Religiously, yes, but we have to look at what it means to our children. What world will our children be living in? And I think the precedent that Europe is setting up, especially when you have an Arab population that comes in and they outpopulate you 10 to 1, you don't have to ask too many questions to know who is going to be ruling over that territory of land another 30 years down the road.
Jodell, in your opinion, is Islam a religion or a philosophy?
It is both. I believe all religions are philosophy, but I think Islam, even more than being a philosophical religion, is a political movement. Because of what is written in the Sharia law, it is a political movement with political objectives that is backed up by a religious agenda.
All right, so looking at the big picture, and with all your research on the uniqueness of the foundation of America, why is America and Israel always singled out?
Our values differ from everyone else's. The Mosaic Code that we have is so precious because it gives us our constitutional liberties. And people that want to oppress you don't want to recognize constitutional liberties. They want their ideas and they want their society to be superior. In Sharia, if you don't convert, you are charged this enormous tax. It's very absorbent. So they want those monetary funds. They want that dominance. They want to, have the success off of the back of others. But when you have a document that says all men are created equal, treat others as you would like to be treated, those are concepts that are very unique to a Judeo-Christian heritage, and it's something that, again, people really want to destroy it so that they then can oppress.
If the world going the way that it's going can succeed in dividing America and Israel, that would be the end, wouldn't it, of Christianity?
I don't know that it would be the end. It would definitely be a dark hole, a dark age that you would go through. And you find that throughout history, when we go through these periods of darkness, we either come out the better because we learn from it, or we just kind of continue it. So I think that is an unwritten page that remains to be seen. I would hope that whatever mistakes are made along the way, that we learn very quickly and that we return to our foundation, because again, it's that foundation that makes us strong. And if you cast it aside, then there is nothing that prevents your oppression. If you don't stand for Israel, then you're abandoning the one democratic state within a territory of people who, of states and of, whether we talk the Palestinian Authority or we talk Gaza, we are talking about societies that oppress their own people. I went to Israel not too long ago, and you had mansions all across the Palestinian Authority that you don't hear people talk about. I mean, they're just 6, 7-story houses, and there are thousands of them. But then you have these very, very poor communities where, you just have, they don't even have basic sustenance. So there's a great disparity there, and that is going to be exploited when you don't have a constitutional foundation.
You said earlier history is probably the greatest asset that we have to correct our ways, and Israel's history is certainly older than the United States as it relates to a people. And every time Israel as a people got into trouble and abandoned God, they woke up and returned to God. Do you think we will learn from this?
I I certainly hope so. I think there is incredible potential there, but I do think that it begins with parents instilling this vision and this knowledge within their children. You know, to return to something, you have to have that knowledge in the first place. So that's where our job as parents comes in, to educate our children, to instill that knowledge, and so that they can return when, you know, they try some of these different political theories out, some of the different religious theories out, and they kind of come up against a dead wall. We need to be able to give them something to come back to.
Part of the culture today is let them do their thing, I'll do my thing, not recognizing that their thing is to take over your thing. I mean, that to me seems to be the dilemma that we're in. We have a large population that's extremely tolerant, and I think that is wonderful, but they're almost tolerant to the ignorance, to being a point of ignorance of what the other motive is really all about.
Yeah, you know, and this is where I encourage everybody who is watching, I really encourage you, go pick up some literature on Islam. So there's a lot of stuff on Amazon. Read some basic literature about the beliefs. When you come to understand what the motive is, when I believe it is, there's two Qurans, there's the Medina and the Mecca Quran, and when you look at the Medina Quran, where 70% of it teaches jihad, it kind of changes your perspective on it as a tolerant, loving, embracing religion. So when you realize that you are the target, you know, you have to kind of question where your love of your neighbor ends and where the protection of you and your family begins.
Wow. So that in itself probably explains that there's really no such thing as a moderate Islamic or moderate Muslim. They can't speak out against what they really fundamentally believe.
That's true. And there has been Pew Research. I attended a national security advisory meeting back in November where it talked about in research, and again, you know, this is very subjective because it is, you know, kind of, you know, phone call research that's done by Pew or other organizations. And they found that even within your moderate Muslims, that if they became the majority, most of them would support some sort of open jihad once they had the upper hand. And that is, in fact, what the Quran teaches. The Quran teaches that as long as you have an entity that pushes back against you, so maybe there's retaliation, then you go subservient, you lurk in the shadows. But as long as you are performing acts of terror and as long as they are succeeding, keep at it. And then when you become the majority, that is when everybody within your sect then joins with you, because you're the strong and you have the dominance. So yeah, so, you know, reading and education really enlightens our understanding of who we are inviting to live next door to us.
Jodell, you're an inspiration. Let me just say to our viewers, go to YHWHExists.com. That's her website. Check out her book at the stores. Get a copy of it. It's an incredible research document. By the way, you say you're working on a blog. They can get that at your website?
Yeah, actually, my blog is just JodellOnstott.com. You can just Google it, and it should pop right up.
All right, JodellOnstott.com. That's ONSTOTT, or go to YHWHExists.com. Thanks, Jodell. You're a delight. Looking forward to many visits ahead.
Thank you.
All right, we'll see you next time on Focus Today.